All right, here we are at the end of World War I. All right, we're going to look at the legacy in terms of the impact the war had. We'll focus in on the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson's 14 points, the League of Nations. But most importantly, all right, we need to make the connection that World War I is going to lead to World War II happening. Now, if we thought World War I was bad in terms of technology and casualties, World War II is going to blow it completely out of the water. All right, of the two, it is by far the more deadly of the two conflicts. So pay attention when we start looking at the treaty and what it does to Germany. All right, but first we need to look at Armistice Day. All right, it's the U.S. government now deems it Veterans Day. It's where both sides agreed to stop fighting. It doesn't mean that they agreed to end the war. It just means that they agreed to stop fighting in order to let diplomacy resume. So the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, which Veterans Day is November 11th. All right, so that's just one of those little things in history there. All right, now we get into our war pack stuff. President Woodrow Wilson, president throughout the duration of World War I, right? He understood that small conflicts are going to occur, whether it's over natural resources or boundary issues, but he wanted to prevent a global conflict from happening again. Like we just had World War I, all of those different countries, all of those casualties. He wanted to try and put something in place to avoid that happening. So his plan for how to go about doing this was called the 14 points. So he pitches his idea to Congress in 1918 at the end of the war, right, where he maps out 14 things he thinks should happen to keep war from happening. Now, we're not going to go through all 14. We're just going to focus in on some of the biggies. So here are 4 or 5 of the biggies, right? Now, all of these are in some way, most of the 4, this one's not part of that, right? But most of the 4 are, that's an M, that's my boy handwriting. Right. Most of them are related to our main clauses. Remember how we had militarism, alliance system, imperialism, nationalism, and all 4 letters of the word main translate to one of the clauses. So he called for smaller military forces. That's the A. An end to the alliance system. That would be the A. Smaller military forces was the M. Sorry. A for alliance system. Now, self-determination. Right, that's going to be the desire to for people to have their own country, their own nation. So if you think about us when we were 13 colonies of Great Britain, we wanted our own nation. That is self-determination. So that would include the I and the N, because it's countries losing their colonies, which is imperialism, and it's new countries being formed for ethnic groups, which would be the N. Free trade kind of goes in there with imperialism, and then freedom of the seas is because of U-boat warfare. All right, so most of his 14 points are all related in some way to the causes of World War I. So the treaty that ends it is known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, all throughout history, right, peace treaties are named after the location where they're signed. So if World War I, the treaty that ended it was signed in Port Jervis, right, it would be known as the Treaty of Port Jervis. All right, so these are the lead nations. Their nickname is the Big Four. All right, so these would be the leaders of the 4 nations here, right? U.S., Great Britain, Italy, and France. It would be the allied countries, right? Russia was part of the Allies, but they left early, so they weren't allowed to be part of the delegation at the Treaty of Versailles. Even though the United States came in at the end, they were still given a seat at the table. And this is probably the number one goal of the Treaty of Versailles, and historians will argue that it's not ultimately a fair thing. History will show that it was the wrong thing to do. But Great Britain, Italy, and France, they all fought during World War I. Obviously, most of the fighting took place in France. Right? They blamed Germany for World War I. They blamed for building up their military. Right? Even though Germany just had that alliance with Austria-Hungary, they really weren't responsible for starting it. Right? So what they wanted to do was they wanted to punish Germany. They actually had a clause put in their treaty, right, that specifically said Germany was to blame, and they forced Germany to sign it. So Germany kind of had to acknowledge blame for the war. But this paragraph is important, all right? It kind of shows you where the groundwork for World War II is going to come about, and when Adolf Hitler starts doing his thing in Germany, he's actually going to play on all of this unhappiness and this hatred that the German people have for the rest of Europe, and he convinces them that they're better. We'll get to that when we do World War II. Okay, here are some of the results of the treaty. Right, we were talking kind of about what Germany had to do. Right, you can see they had to give up some land, they had to disband their military, they had to pay over $30 billion in reparations. Reparations is one of your vocabulary words. Right, it is just repayment for war damages. All right. All right, and then the last part is Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations is going to be put into the treaty, and we're going to focus in on that in more detail. But first, I want to show you a map. Okay, so I have two circles. I'm going to give you two maps. Maps are going to be in relatively the same area, right? I just want you to focus in on one. So I'll give you map one. All right, this is Europe before World War II or World War I. Excuse me. All right, I want you to focus in on the size of Germany here. All right, if I drew my map all the way around it, or my pen, I'm not really getting the full border. Looks kind of like a dinosaur, right? But that would be the rough estimate of how Germany was shaped, right? And then this one is going to be Austria-Hungary. Right? You can see they're two sizable nations, all right? They take up an awful lot of land, right? They're going to actually, now look, I'm getting ahead of myself. Now look at the difference. You'll see Germany loses like roughly a third of its territory. And I'll give you a quarter if you can find Austria-Hungary on this map. That's Austria-Hungary, not Austria and Hungary, right? So here's Austria, this little itty bitty one here, and here's Hungary, which is now a completely different country, right? What do you notice about the size of Austria-Hungary here and the size of Austria and Hungary here, right? There are all kinds of new countries created. Czechoslovakia is created, Poland's created, right? Yugoslavia is created. So all these countries are now being created as a result of World War I. That would be that whole nationalism, imperialism idea. Okay, now we get into Wilson's League of Nations. Right? Now this is a global peacekeeping organization, meaning their goal is to prevent future wars. Very similar to the United Nations, which is around today. It's just the only difference between the two is that the United States is in one and wasn't in another. So this actually ends up failing, and World War II happens as a result of this, right? But the reason why it fails is because the U.S. does not join the League of Nations. So the Senate, as part of the checks and balances system, the president can negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to ratify it. You might remember that from 7th grade, right? The U.S. Senate actually said no. And they did have a pretty good reason for saying no. They thought that if we joined the League of Nations, it would be just kind of similar to an alliance system. It would force the United States to have to get involved in future conflicts. And that goes against the U.S. policy of isolationism, where we were just worried about ourselves. We're just worried about the Western Hemisphere. So, you know, was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? You can go back and forth all day. But in the end, the Senate says no because it will involve us in future conflicts. All right, and then these are just some political cartoons that kind of, give you two different viewpoints. This one down here gives you the viewpoint of how the United States would be tied in to what goes on around the world by being in the League of Nations. And then this one is going to give you a little bit of foreshadowing and show you how ineffective the League is going to be because the U.S. is not involved. So this bridge isn't going to be a very strong bridge because the United States is not, the keystone is not in there. So if you apply that to the League of Nations, you'll get it. Okay. Now the last part we're going to look at is some of the social changes. Now the first three are just a review from topic 2, but this is the changes in people's lives that happen as a result of the war. Right? We know that there are new opportunities in factories. You know that factories are now making tanks and airplanes and guns and bullets, so more and more jobs. More and more African Americans are moving from the south to the north, making a big population surge. It's also going to lead to some conflict or some tension. Right? The KKK makes its comeback in the 1920s, right, after World War I's over. And we know that women are going to take a more active role in factories and the workplace. Right? But this is with the Russian Revolution, this is probably the biggest social change. When Russia has its own revolution, they become a communist nation, right? They become the Soviet Union. We're going to focus a lot on that when we do the Cold War, right? But it essentially means government control, right? And here in the United States, we don't have government control of the lives of its citizens, right? So once the Soviet Union was created and we now had communism in the world, right, there became a big fear, and red is usually the color that's associated. I'm not using a red pen, but that's just a mere coincidence, all right? But the idea was that people were afraid of communists, and they didn't want communism to spread to the United States. So you had the Red Scare, you had Palmer raids, okay? These were, blatant disregard for people's rights, right, because they were afraid of communism. You can kind of relate that same idea to fear of terrorism, all right? We'll talk about that in a lot more detail, all right? And then this idea of the Red Scare and a fear of immigrants, right, is going to continue to spread. This was a famous trial that happened, right? Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants. They were arrested for murder, and there was such a public outcry or negativity towards immigrants that they were actually found guilty, even though there was no real clear-cut evidence. It was really just public opinion, right? But that's a shining example of how negative this time was and how unfair Americans treated immigrants at the time, right? And then I talked to you about violence between the two, right? So with topic 3, really the big thing you want to get out of that is Wilson's 14 points and his League of Nations and how it failed because the United States didn't get involved. Right? And then the last one, I found some pictures that just tried to kind of show you the change in mindset that people had regarding war. All throughout the 1800s, it sounds silly to say, but war was considered an honorable thing, right? So it was very romantic in terms of people aspired to play a role in it, the courage, the bravery, right? But World War I really changed that mindset, especially with the technology and the sheer amount of casualties. So some of these pictures go a long way towards showing you people's changed views about war. So you're not getting a bravery or honorable vibe out of any of these pictures, which unfortunately was the true nature of World War I.